Tonight we are reading Greek mythology. This is a book with about 151 pages. Europa and the Bull, Odysseus escaping from the Cyclops Polyphemus, Athena, the birth of Athena, Athena and Hercules, Apollo and Hercules disputing the tripod, Artemis shooting a stag, Amazon, Helios in his chariot, the winged horses of Helios, Nereus fighting with Hercules, the triumph of Poseidon and Amphitrite, Meleager, Demeter and Kore, Perseus and the Gorgon, Achilles and Patroclus, Theseus, Hercules and Nessus, Theseus killing the Minotaur, Dionysus and Satyrs, Atalanta, Medea rejuvenating the ram, watched by Peleus, Oedipus and the Sphinx, Silenus, the Argonauts, Orpheus, Eurydice, and Hermes, the Aegean Pantheon, the formation of the world and birth of the gods, Cronus, birth of Zeus, origins of humanity, Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Hermes, Ares, Hephaestus, Hephaestus, Aphrodite, Poseidon, Hestia, the sidereal and meteorological gods, Helios, Selene, Eos, Orion, Pleiades or Pleiades, the Hyades, gods of the winds, gods of the waters, divinities of the sea, freshwater divinities, divinities of the earth, Gaia, Rhea, and Cybele, Demeter, Dionysus, divinities concerned with the life of man, divinities of birth and health, divinities of mortality, the underworld, sovereign of the underworld, the auxiliaries of Hades, Hercules, the 12 labors, Theseus and the heroes of Attica, the other heroes of Attica, Bellerophon and the heroes of Corinth, Perseus and the heroes of Argolis, the Dioscuri and the heroes of Laconia, Helen and the Trojan War, Oedipus and the heroes of Boeotia, Meleager and the heroes of Aetolia, Peleus, the Argonauts and the heroes of Thessaly, Orpheus and the heroes of Thrace, Minos and the heroes of Crete. All right, now let's start getting into it. That was just the contents. The introduction. Mythology in all advanced civilizations contains many elements, and none is more diverse than that of the Greeks. The figures that people Greek mythology... I don't know that this sentence is very good. The figures that people Greek mythology fall into three groups. The first is that of the gods of Olympus, many of whom owe some attributes to the primitive fertility gods which they supplanted. The ideals that the gods embodied developed and changed with the growing sophistication of Greek civilization. Yet the gods retained many characteristics which today we might consider all too human, unworthy of a god. Notably, they were often lustful or vengeful. But the Greek concept of religion was very different from our own, and the way in which the gods are shown to take an active part in the affairs of mortal beings, to love them on occasion, and even, as Aphrodite, to be wounded by them, implies no disrespect. Gods and mortals had many characteristics in common, but the differences between them were, if anything, accentuated by the belief that the origins of the two races were connected. The second category of Greek myth seeks to explain natural phenomena such as the sun, the moon, the winds, sea storms, the seasons, fertility, and so forth. These myths are generally straightforward, details of the stories often being directly related to the natural phenomena concerned. The third category of myths centers on the heroes. These were mortals, but they often had at least one immortal ancestor. They often excited the enmity of both gods and humans, and though they could be killed, they were sometimes, like Hercules, admitted to Olympus on their death. Greek mythology has been a source of inspiration to artists and writers for centuries, especially during the Renaissance and in our own century. The present volume, which draws upon the best scholarly sources, is a reliable guide to this unending source of artistic inspiration, and the stories for themselves never fail to make stimulating and enjoyable reading. From the 3rd century BC, the Greek and Roman gods were equated, and the Greek gods were given new names which usage has made familiar. It may therefore be useful to give a list of such names: Cronus, Saturn; Eros, Cupid; Gaia, Telos; Charites, Gratiae, charities and gratitudes; Zeus, Jupiter; Poseidon, Neptune; Hera, Juno; Hestia, Vestia; Athena, Minerva; Demeter, Ceres; Artemis, Diana; Dionysus, Bacchus; Apollo, Aesculapius; Selene, Luna; Moerai, Parcae, Fates; Hermes, Mercury; Hades, Pluto; Ares, Mars; Persephone, Proserpina; Hephaestus, Vulcan; Erinis, Furiae; Aphrodite, Venus; Heracles, Hercules. That's the introduction. Okay, pre-Hellenic mythology. It is known that well before the peoples whom we know as the Greeks had emerged from primitive barbarism, there existed in the basin of the Aegean Sea a Mediterranean civilization which had its center in Crete. Aegean civilization, which had already made tentative beginnings in the 3rd millennium, reached its apogee toward the 6th century BC, when it spread to continental Greece, starting in Argolis, Mycenae. This Cretan civilization, called Minoan after King Minos, its traditional founder, lost most of its influence about 1400 BC, with the destruction by invaders, or perhaps by earthquake or volcanic eruption, of the palace of Knossos. The Mycenaean civilization collapsed in turn with the Dorian invasions of 1200 BC. It was destroyed in the 12th century by the invasions of the Dorians, a people coming from the north of Greece. The first form Aegean religion took was fetishism, the worship of sacred stones, of pillars, of weapons, particularly the double axe, of trees and animals. Later, when an anthropomorphic conception of divinity had arisen, the Cretan pantheon was formed and myths were created. We find survivals of such myths in a great many Greek legends. For instance, the birth of Zeus in Crete, Europa and the bull, Cretans brought by Apollo to Delphi to be priests of his cult, the Minotaur, etc. When they moved to continental Greece, however, the Aegean divinities took on a Hellenic aspect beneath which their original physiognomy disappeared. Thus, what we know about the Aegean pantheon is reduced to very little. The Aegean pantheon, the great goddess, the chief deity of the Aegeans was, like that of many Asiatic cults, feminine. She was the great goddess, the universal mother, in whom were united all the attributes and functions of divinity. Above all, she symbolized fertility, and her influence extended over plants and animals as well as humans. All the universe was her domain. As celestial goddess, she regulated the course of the heavenly bodies and controlled the alternating seasons. On earth, she caused the products of the soil to flourish. She gave men riches, protected them in battle, and at sea guided them on their adventurous voyages. She killed or tamed fierce beasts, and finally, she also reigned over the underworld. The great goddess is represented, depending on the epoch, either crouching or standing. Sometimes she is nude, sometimes dressed like a Cretan woman. In the latter case, she wears a flounced skirt, and her bosom is either entirely bare or covered with a corsage, which leaves her breasts exposed. Her headdress varies. Her hair may be free, knotted with a simple fillet. It may be covered either by a sort of turban decorated with flowers or aigrettes. These words are not helping me understand anything. The peaks of Olympus, the throne of Zeus, and seats of the gods. All right, that was a little subtitle. Her headdress varies, a turban with aigrettes, or by a conical tiara in the oriental manner, or again by a very tall tiara in the shape of a topless cone. Although the type is always the same and only the attributes and details of dress vary, it is questionable if a single divinity is concerned. On the contrary, these various representations may well depict distinct goddesses, each having her own character. What was the name of the mother goddess of the Aegeans? Here again, in the absence of documentation, we are left to conjecture. It seems that she was worshipped in Crete under the name Rhea. At least this was the name later associated with the ancient Cretan divinity in the cult of Zeus. Zeus was said to be her son, a tradition which Hesiod was to revive in his Theogony. Two other names of Cretan goddesses have been preserved, Dictina and Britomartis. In legends, the Greeks applied the two names to the same divinity. The snake goddess. Her dress leaves her breast exposed. She holds a snake in each hand, and her headdress is surmounted by a bird, statuette in faience from Knossos, Heracleion Museum. Turn the page to page 10. We're already 10 pages in. Only 15 sets to go. Delphi, one of the foremost centers of divination in ancient Greece, and renowned particularly for its association with the cult of Apollo. Dictina, whom the Greeks called the goddess of the nets, was perhaps the goddess of Mount Dicte, a mountain in Crete, which was later said to be the birthplace of Zeus. She would then be the mother goddess. Britomartis means the sweet virgin, a denomination which could not very well be applied to the great mother of the universe. According to the Greek legend, Britomartis was the young virgin huntress who pursued wild beasts in the forest of Crete. She was said to be the daughter of Zeus. Venus saw her and was captivated by her beauty. He offered her his love, but was refused. Head of a bull symbolizing the bull god from Knossos, Olympia Museum. He then attempted violence, but Britomartis fled, and after a race which lasted no less than 9 months, in order finally to escape Minos, she flung herself off a high rock into the sea. She fell into the nets of a fisherman, and for that reason received the name Dictina. As a reward for her chastity, Artemis raised her to the rank of the immortals, and thenceforth she appeared during the night to navigators. The Greeks made the assimilation even closer and called Dictina Britomartis the Cretan Artemis, the god. The Aegeans associated a god with the great goddess. It seems that, at least originally, in imitation of the cults of Western Asia, this god was thought of as subordinate to the goddess. But though we are informed of the relationship between Tammuz and Ishtar, between Attis and Cybele, and between Adonis and Astarte, no indication has yet come to light about the relationship between the Aegean god and goddess. A celestial divinity, like the goddess with whom he was associated, the Aegean god bore the epithet Asterios, the starry. He is found again under the name Asterion, king of Crete, who married Europa after her adventure with Zeus. Afterwards, he was assimilated with Zeus himself, whose legend was thus enriched with Cretan contribution. The particularity or peculiarity of the Cretan god was the mingling of animal and human features which composed his nature. The bull, as in many Asiatic religions, had been adopted since the earliest ages as the Aegean symbol of strength and creative energy. It later became the emblem of the great god, and as such played an important part in Cretan legends. It even became incorporated in the divine nature. The Minotaur is analogous to the bull god of the Elamites and to the Enki of the Sumerians, who was also the savage bull of the sky and the earth. The bull god was not the only aspect under which the Cretan god appeared. Besides the Minotaur, there was also Minos. Therefore, the god was also conceived in human form, and it was thus that he sometimes appeared to his worshippers in all his terrifying majesty. But whether we are concerned with Minos or the Minotaur, we know them only through the modifications they underwent when Hellenized. We therefore mention them here only in passing and reserve a later occasion to discuss them at greater length when we meet them again in the heroic legends of classical Greece. Minoan goddess rising amidst plants from the ground. The goddess holds flowers in her hand, impression from a seal. Goddess and her attendant from a Minoan seal. A female idol, probably a mother goddess. She is depicted with the bull's horns of consecration and birds on her head. Clay figure of the Minoan. All right, I'll just show you there's some pictures there. I don't know if that was helpful. The mythology of classical Greece. Greek theogonies. The Greek pantheon was established as early as the Homeric epoch. The many divinities of which it was composed generally appear in the Iliad and Odyssey, with their characteristic physiognomy, their traditional attributes, and their own time-honored legends. But the poet tells us nothing of their origin or their past. At the most, he mentions that Zeus is the son of Cronus, and says incidentally that Oceanus and his spouse Tethys were the creators of gods and living beings. It was only later that the Greeks felt the need to provide their gods with a genealogy and a history. Hesiod's poem, The Theogony, written in about the 8th century BC, is the oldest Greek attempt at mythological classification. While recounting the origin of the gods, recalling their chief adventures and establishing their relationships, he also claims to explain the formation of the universe. The poem is thus as much a cosmogony as a theogony, a reflection of popular beliefs. The Theogony of Hesiod is had a kind of official recognition in Greece from the 6th century BC until the beginning of the Christian era. However, other theogonies were elaborated under the influence of Orphic doctrines, and these theogonies departed widely from the traditions of Hesiod. But the Orphic theogonies, known only to the initiated, were never popular. In addition, they were too intermingled with foreign contributions, notably Asiatic, to be specifically Greek in character. We shall therefore merely give a summary of their principal features, having first given Hesiod's version of the origins of the world. The formation of the world and the birth of the gods. Chaos and Gaia. In the beginning, Hesiod says, there was chaos, vast and dark space. Then appeared Gaia, the deep-breasted earth, and finally Eros, the love which softens hearts, whose fructifying influence would thenceforth preside over the formation of beings and things. From chaos were born Erebus and Night, who uniting gave birth in their turn to Ether and Hemera, the day. For her part, Gaia first bore Uranus, the sky crowned with stars, whom she made her equal in grandeur, so that he entirely covered her. Then she created the high mountains in Pontus, the sterile sea with its harmonious waves. Uranus and Gaia. The Uranus group. The universe had been formed. It remained to be peopled. Gaia united with her son Uranus and produced the first race, the Titans. There were 12 of them, 6 male and 6 female: Oceanus, Coeus, Hyperion, Creus, Iapetus, Cronus, Theia, Rhea, Mnemosyne, Phoebe, Tithes, and Thamus. Uranus and Gaia then gave birth to the Cyclopes, or Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, who resembled the other gods, but only had one eye in the middle of their forehead. Finally, they bore 3 monsters, Cotus, Briareus, and Gyges. From their shoulders sprang 100 invincible arms, and above these powerful limbs rose 50 heads attached to their backs. For this reason, they were called the Hecatoncheires, or the Centimanes. Uranus could only regard his offspring with horror, and as soon as they were born, he shut them up in the depths of the earth. Gaia at first mourned, but afterwards grew angry and meditated terrible vengeance against her husband. From her bosom she drew forth gleaming steel, fashioned a sharp sickle or harpe, and explained to her children the plan she made. All of them hesitated, struck with horror. Only the astute Cronus, her last-born, volunteered to support his mother. When evening fell, Uranus, accompanied by Night, came as usual to rejoin his wife. When he unsuspectingly slept, Cronus, who with his mother's aid lay in hiding, armed himself with the sickle, atrociously mutilated his father, and cast the bleeding genitals into the sea. From the terrible wound black blood dropped, and the drops, seeping into the earth, gave birth to the redoubtable Furies, to monstrous giants, and to the ash-tree nymphs, the Meliae. As for the debris which floated on the surface of the waves, it broke into a white foam, from which was born a young goddess Aphrodite, who was first carried toward the divine Cythera, and thence as far as Cyprus surrounded with waves. The character of the first gods. Such are the first divine figures in the first drama they underwent. Some of the actors are, however, rather ill-defined. Hesiod's Chaos, a name which comes from a Greek root meaning to gape, simply designates an open space. Only later, because of a false derivation from a word meaning to pour, was chaos considered to mean the confused and unorganized mass of the elements scattered through space. The same may be said of Hesiod's Eros, who has nothing in common with the Eros, whom we shall meet in later legends. Here, Eros has only a metaphysical significance. He represents the force of attraction which causes beings to come together. Uranus, son and husband of Gaia, is the starlit sky. It may be pointed out that he received no cult in Greece. This conception of the sky and the earth as 2 primordial divinities is common to all Indo-European peoples. Gaia. The only divinity in well-defined features is Gaia, the earth. According to Hesiod, it seems likely that Gaia, from whom all things issued, had been the great deity of the primitive Greeks. Like the Aegeans and like the peoples of Asia, the Greeks must doubtless have originally worshipped the earth, in whom they beheld the mother goddess. This is again confirmed by the Homeric hymn, in which the poet says, "I shall sing of Gaia, universal mother, firmly founded, the oldest of divinities. Gaia, the deep-breasted, whose soil nourishes all that exists, and by whose benevolence men are blessed with fair children and all the pleasant fruits of the earth, was thus at one time the supreme goddess, whose majesty was acknowledged not only by men, but by the gods themselves. Later, when the victorious dynasty of the Olympians was established, her prestige was not lessened. It was still Gaia whom the gods invoked when they made oaths. I swear by Gaia and the vast sky above her, Hera proclaims when, in the Iliad, she answers Zeus's accusations. Gaia, the omnipotent, not only created the universe and bore the first race of the gods, but also gave birth to the human race. Thus, in the myth of Erichthonius, she draws him forth from her own bosom and offers him to Athena. She was the first inhabitant of Attica. The power of Gaia was also manifest in her gift of foretelling the future. The Oracle of Delphi, the chief center of divination in ancient Greece, had originally been sacred to Gaia before it was won by Apollo. Gaia, the Greek mother goddess, terracotta statue from Tanagra. Right, Cronus devouring his children by Goya. Check out that little statue there. Later, as other divinities rose in the estimation of men, the role of Gaia gradually became less important. Her cult, however, always continued in Greece. She presided over marriages and was honored as preeminent among prophetesses. At Patras, the sick came to consult her. She was particularly venerated at Aigai, at Delphi, and at Olympia. She had sanctuaries at Dodona, Tegea, Sparta, and at Athens, near the Areopagus. She was offered first fruits and grain, but when she was invoked as the guardian of the sanctity of oaths, a black ewe was sacrificed in her honor. She was commonly represented in the form of a gigantic woman. The Titans. The Titans, who formed the first divine race, had, for the most part, no clearly defined personality. The etymology of their name, which Hesiod gives from a word meaning to stretch out, because they had stretched out their hand against their father, is fanciful. The name probably derives from a Cretan word which meant king. In Greece, the Titans were ultimately honored as the ancestors of men. To them was attributed the invention of the arts and of magic. Kyklopes and Hecatoncheires in Hesiod. The Kyklopes, or the Cyclopses, were storm deities, as their names indicate. Brontes, thunder; Steropes, lightning; Arges, thunderbolt. As for the three Hecatoncheires, or Gentemanes, their names characterize them. Cotas, the furious; Briareus, the vigorous; Giges, the big-limbed. Titans, Kyklopes, and Hecatoncheires symbolize the tumultuous forces of nature. Orphic cosmogonies, or cosmogonies. The followers of Orphism, opposed to the above primitive and popular... I'm tired. Okay. The followers of Orphism, opposed to the above primitive and popular cosmogony and other explanations of the origin of things. They claimed as their authority the apocryphal writings attributed to Orpheus, which seem actually to have been written by a priest named Onomacritus. The philosophic and scientific preoccupations which all these systems reflect, the subtleties in which they delight, and the many abstractions which they employ, remove them from the realm of the primitive They are metaphysical systems rather than mythology. Broadly speaking, they state that the first principle was Chronos, or time, from which came chaos, which symbolized the infinite, and ether, which symbolized the finite. Chaos was surrounded by night, which formed the enveloping cover under which, by the creative action of ether, cosmic matter was slowly organized. This, finally, assumed the shape of an egg, which night formed the shell. In the center of this gigantic egg, whose upper section formed the vault of the sky, and whose lower section was the earth, was born the first being, Phanes, the light. It was Phanes who, by union with night, created heaven and earth. He was also Zeus's father. We shall not dwell longer on this brief summary of Orphic doctrine, for we shall meet it again when we come to the god Dionysus, who became the supreme god of Orphism. Let us return to Hesiod's account of the fate of the second divine dynasty. Cronus, the birth of Zeus. The reign of Cronus. When Uranus was reduced to impotence, Cronus liberated his brothers, the Titans, with the exception of the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, and became chief of the new dynasty. Under his reign, the work of creation continued. Night gave birth to Doom, Moros, to Black Care, Moera, and to Death, then to Sleep and his retinue of dreams. She then bore bantering gaiety, Momus, and wailing misery, Oisus, and the Hesperides, who guarded the golden apples beyond the ocean. Then came the Fates, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, who apportioned to each mortal born his share of good and evil. Night also bore Nemesis, fearful to the mortals, fraud, incontinence, old age, and Eris, who, in turn, gave birth to sorrow, forgetfulness, and hunger, to disease, combat, murder, battles, massacres, quarrels, lies, and equivocations, to injustice and oaths. Pontus, the sea, united with Gaia, the earth, to produce Nereus, the truthful, Thaumas, the monstrous, Phorkys, the intrepid, and pretty cheeked Geto and Oerabia with the heart of steel. To Nereus and Doris, a daughter of the ocean, were born 50 daughters, the Nereides. To Thaumus and Electra were born Iris, the rainbow, and the Harpies with their fair tresses. By Phorkys, Geto bore the Gracchi, the old ones, who came into the world with white hair, and the Gorgons, who lived beyond the ocean in the land of Hesperides. The Titans also fathered children either by their sisters or by nymphs. Oceanos and Tethys had 3,000 sons, the rivers, and 3,000 daughters, the water nymphs, plus Metis, wisdom, Tyche, fortune, and Styx, the infernal river. To Hyperion and Thea were born Helios, the sun, Selene, the moon, and Eos, the dawn. Coeus and Phoebe were the parents of Leto and Asteria. By Orebia, Creus had Astraeus, Pallas, and Perses. By the Oceanid, Clymene, or according to others by Asia, Iapetos fathered Atlas, Menoetios, Epimetheus, and Prometheus. Finally, Cronus married his sister Rhea, who gave him 3 daughters, Hestia, Demeter, and Hera, who had 3 sons, Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus. But whether it was that he feared, it seems an oracle had predicted that he would be supplanted by one of his children, or whether he had agreed with his older brothers, the Titans, to leave no posterity, Cronos swallowed each of his children as it was born. The birth and childhood of Zeus. Rhea, his wife, was overwhelmed with boundless grief. She asked herself in despair if she were condemned to see all her progeny thus disappear. I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. When the time approached for her to give birth to Zeus, she beseeched her own parents, Uranus and Gaia, to help her save this child. On their advice, she went to Crete, and there, in a deep cavern, under the forests of Mount Aegaeum, she brought forth her son. Gaia took the newborn baby and undertook to bring it up. There, Rhea wrapped up an enormous stone in swaddling cloths and presented it to the unsuspecting Cronus, who swallowed it at once. Meanwhile, Gaia had carried her grandson to Mount Ida, others say to Mount Dicte, and given him for safekeeping into the hands of the nymphs, Adrasteia and Ida, daughters of Melesius, king of Crete. The 2 nymphs surrounded the young god with care and attention. The Curetes executed warlike dances around the cradle, beating their bronze shields with their swords so that Cronus should not hear the baby crying. Who exactly were these Curetes? In primitive times, there had been a tribe of this name settled in Aetolia. On the other hand, the Greeks gave them the epithet Gegenes, children of the earth, or Imbrogenes, children of the rain, so they may have been earth spirits. Herodotus, however, calls them the Phoenicians, followers of Cadmus, who had settled in Crete. Others say they came from Phrygia. Probably the Curetes were Cretan priests devoted to the orgiastic cult of the great goddess Rhea. They were distinguished by their half-warrior, half-sacerdotal character. To increase their prestige, the first among them were deified, and thus became the sacred Curetes, the protectors of Zeus. They had temples, notably in Messina, and they were invoked in making oaths, which tends to confirm their original identity as earth spirits. The Curetes appear many times in the mythological history of Greece. On Hera's orders, they spirited away at birth the young Epaphus, son of Zeus and Io, and were in consequence put to death by Zeus. Thus sheltered from his father's cruelty, the young Zeus grew up in the forests of Ida. The goat, Amalthea, a wonderful animal whose aspect terrified even the immortals, suckled the infant god. In gratitude, Zeus later placed among her the constellations, and from her hide, which no arrow could pierce, he made the redoubtable Aegis. To the nymphs he gave one of her horns, conferring upon it the marvelous property of refilling itself inexhaustibly with whatever food or drink it was wished for. This was the horn of plenty, cornucopia. According to certain authors, Amalthea was the wife of Melesius and suckled the young god with her milk. Others make her a nymph who simply watched over the child Zeus, claiming that the god was fed on ambrosia and nectar brought to him by doves and an eagle. And if Astratea, Ad- Adrastea, and Ida are called daughters of Meliseus, from the Greeks Melissa, a bee, was this not because the bees of Ida brought their scented honey to the divine child? The oracle, which had predicted to Cronus that he would one day be overthrown by one of his sons, had not lied. As soon as Zeus had reached manhood, he planned to punish his father. Apollodorus tells us that he summoned to his aid Metis, daughter of Oceanus. Metis gave Cronus a draught that made him vomit up the stone, and with it his children, the gods, whom he had swallowed. Vanquished by the might of Zeus, Cronus was driven from the sky and cast to the very depths of the universe, and there enchained in the region which stretches beneath the earth and the sterile sea. This, at least, is what Homer says. According to others, Cronus was sent to the ends of the earth to dwell in bliss, or plunged into the mysterious slumber in distant Thule. The era of the Olympians now began. The War of the Titans and the Olympians, which raged for 10 years. The Titans here are being crushed under boulders thrown by the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires. The children of Zeus among the oaks of Mount Ida. While the nymph Ida gathers honeycombs, her sister Adrastea holds the goat Amalthea so that the infant Zeus may suck her milk. All right. The revolt of the Titans. The Titans, with the exceptions of Oceanus, were jealous of the new gods and wished to reconquer the kingdom of which they had been dispossessed. Then began the terrible struggle. From their stronghold on Mount Othyris, the Titans launched furious attacks upon Olympus. For 10 years, the outcome of the war remained doubtful. Zeus descended into Tartarus, where, guarded by the monster Campe, the Hecatoncheires and the Cyclopes were kept prisoners. He set them free and made them his allies. The Cyclopes gave him the thunderbolt, and the Hecatoncheires put their invincible arms at his service. Seizing in their enormous arms great boulders, they crushed the Titans. Sea and earth resounded with the horrifying clamor, and the shaken firmament groaned aloud. Zeus, too, was unable to curb his warlike rage, and joined in the fray. From the heights of Olympus, Hesiod tells us, from the heights of the heavens, he hurled thunder and lightning. With unwearying hand he flung bolt after bolt, and the air was rent with sound and fury. The fertile earth shuddered and burned. Vast forests flamed, and all things melted and boiled. The river ocean, the immense sea, and the entire earth. Around the infernal Titans arose stifling mists and blazing air. Their bold glances were blinded by flashes of lightning. The fire even reached chaos, and from what the eye could behold and the ear distinguish, one would have said that sky and earth were mingled, the earth shaken on its very foundations, the sky crashing down from its heights. In spite of their pride and courage, the Titans were finally defeated, and bound with chains, cast into the abysmal depths of the earth, as far below its surface as the earth itself from the sky. It is there, among impenetrable shadows and foul vapors, at the very end of the world, that the Titans are buried by the will of the King of the heavens. The war of the giants. Zeus had scarcely put down this dangerous revolt when he was forced to undergo a new struggle, this time against the giants. The giants had sprung from the blood of the mutilated Uranus, and were not only distinguished for their size, for these monstrous sons of the earth had legs like serpents, and their feet were formed of reptiles' heads. at the instant that they emerged from the entrails at the ground of Phlegra in the peninsula of Palene. They appeared in glittering armor, grasping enormous spears. Porphyrion and Alcyonius were their leaders. They at once attacked Olympus, whose mass dominated the plain of Phlegra on the west. Islands, rivers, mountains all gave way before them, while one, says Claudian, with vigorous arm, shook Mount Oeta of Thessaly in the air. Another balanced the summits of Mount Pangaea in his powerful hand. One armed himself with the ice of Mount Athos, another seized Ossa and lifted it, while still another tore up Rhodope. From everywhere the horrible din echoed. To reach the heights of Olympus, the giants piled the surrounding mountains one upon another. Ossa on Pelion. The war between the gods and giants, Athena striking down the giant Enceladus. The winged figure to the right is Nike, decaled from the frieze of the great altar of Zeus, Pergamon Museum, Berlin. But grouped around Zeus, the gods, with the exception of Demeter, who took no part in the struggle, stood their ground before the assailants. Apollo struck down Ephialtes. Clytius fell under the blows of Hecate or Hephaestus. The impetuous Ares pierced Pelorus and Mimas with his sword. Poseidon pursued Polybutes across the sea, flung the island of Nisyros on top of him, and buried him. The war between the gods and the giants. In the center, Zeus strikes the giants with his thunderbolt, Greek amphora of the 4th century. Milos, Livre. The gods alone, however, could not triumph, for the oracle had declared that the sons of Gaia would succumb only to the blows of a mortal. This mortal was Hercules, with whom Dionysus was sometimes associated. While Dionysus struck down Rhytos, or Oritos, Hercules attacked Alcyonius. At first, the giant resisted his blows. Hercules was astonished, but Athena revealed to him that Alcyonius was invulnerable as long as he stood on the soil which had given him birth. The hero then seized the giant in his arms and carried him away from the territory of Palene, and at once slew him. Porphyrion wished to avenge his brother, but Zeus inspired in him a sudden passion for Hera. While the giant pursued Hera, Hercules pierced him with a deadly arrow. From that moment, the defeat of the giants was assured. In vain, Pallas and Enceladus attempted to struggle against Athena. One after another, they were overcome. With the skin of Pallas, Athena fashioned the aegis. For the Enceladus, she buried him under the island of Sicily. Even today, when the giant turns over, the entire island quakes with volcanic eruptions. Typhoeus, or perhaps Typhon. The monster's 3 human torsos terminate in the triple body of a dragon. He holds birds and sparks of fire in his hands, sculpture in porous limestone from Hecatompedon, period of Solon. Opposite, Zeus in the shape of a bull, carrying off Europa, one of several mortal women with whom he loved, bore him Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Sarpedon, red-figured crater by the Berlin painter. This is that right there. Typhoeus. Gaia, however, could not resign herself to the defeat of her children. She raised up against Zeus a final monster, Typhoeus, whom she had borne to Tartarus. He was a terrifying creature whose hands worked ceaselessly and whose feet were never still. From his shoulders sprang 100 horrible dragon's heads, each with a darting black tongue and eyes which spurted searing flame. Gute Nacht. From his thighs emerged innumerable vipers. His body was covered with feathers. Thick bristles sprouted from his head and cheeks. He was taller than the tallest mountains. At the sight of Typhoeus, the gods were seized with fear and fled as far as Egypt. Only Zeus stood firm before the monster, but entwined with the myriad coils of the serpents, he fell into the hands of Typhoeus, who cut the tendons of his hands and feet and imprisoned him in his den in Cilicia. Rescued by Hermes, Zeus renewed the struggle. With his thunderbolts, the god overwhelmed Typhoeus, who fled to Sicily, there crushed him under Etna. Thus, in the first ages of the world, when the elements were not yet mastered and matter was still rebellious, there occurred terrifying cataclysms which threatened to overthrow everything. But the divine wisdom, regulator of the universe, finally imposed its will over the disorderly elements. Harmony was born anew, and man, reassured, gave thanks to the god whose might had triumphed over the forces of evil. The death of Typhoeus assured the final and lasting supremacy of Zeus, and among the Olympians, gods and men acknowledged him as uncontested master. Page 16. Turn the page. Page 17. Well, this is a freaky image. Like he's got that one eye, he's a cyclops over there, some dudes down here. I mean, this is positively crazy. The origins of humanity, page 19. All right, that's almost an hour. We just did all the prehistory before humanity, and then we got the humans parts, so I think we'll leave that for a part 2.